Hello everyone, today we talk briefly and indirectly about medieval dialectics, especially between the end of the 11th and beginning of the 12th century. As you know, this was a moment of great expansion of, in fact, not just of dialectic, but also of philosophy altogether. We made videos about the school of Chartres, starting also with, these great minds like Schwerpunkt, Pope Sylvester II, who really brought altogether just one of the names, but that brought altogether in Western thought the necessity of a comprehensive understanding of the world, of a culture was more elevated than it had been before in terms properly of systematic knowledge, and also in fact of external origin. And as you know, the space here of Europe, the Mediterranean, was being permeated by the recovery of the classic authors through the Arab and the Jewish texts, and in fact the Latin translations were actively sought and carried out by individuals. The school of Chartres was influenced in part by this southern French cultural context that resented a lot, positively speaking, of in fact the Arab influx during the 11th century, and that brought in fact on the fore many authors, including Aristotle, that normally when talking about figures like, in fact, Fulbert of Chartres, and as today about Lanfranc of Pavia and Anselm of Aosta, is kind of underrated, and also considering that these would be the progenitors of the philosophical debate, would lead to even Abelard, and as the initiator of scholastic logic and therefore Aristotelianism, as it was recovered through all these steps. Well, we realized that there was a fil rouge, and that the Neoplatonic background from which most of these authors came from, say, was not absolute and was actually shaded and composite, and not without problems, by the way, because as you know, Aristotle at some point was also put at the index of the forbidden authors, and only later the church managed, with this massive civilizational drift and capacity of essentially giving a rational and scientific character properly to the papal monarchy and what it represented culturally in Europe. In fact, driving away from what had been just mysticism and the ascesis and so on of Neoplatonic origin had dominated fundamentally throughout the early Middle Ages because of Augustine, etc. So the point here is that, of course, the expansion of dialectics entailed and involved also theology, right? So the big deal this time, when the papacy was given itself its reformed physiognomy, and was in fact yet to exercise a control over these thoughts and various philosophical currents, was a delicate phase, because different ideas could spread without being checked and without given possible origin, as it would happen in the 12th century especially, but already before we have seen it since the 11th, and actually how many heterodox movements were even connected to at least the forces that made it possible for the papacy to affirm itself instead in an orthodox sense. And this is a testament, first of all, to the solidity of the system that the Church of Rome had already managed to impress on Western Europe. So the fact that in spite of the let's say all these various influences and philosophical prompts, the face of Europe was fully Christian, was unavoidably sticking to orthodoxy, and this was evident in early medieval times. Especially Latin Germanic Europe was kind of a bulwark of orthodoxy in front of what was going on in the East, where lots of heresies were even backed publicly and officially by the same Constantinople. So that's another chapter. But the elites and the thinkers of the church at this point were provided with this enormous task to start giving properly a structured framework within which to develop these theological speculations. And the dialectical ones were ever more important. This naturally goes in parallel with the enormous political institutional needs for an administration, even just a juridical expertise, as we'll see. Lanfranc of Pavia fundamentally was a jurist, initially was a secular jurist that eventually converted to become Archbishop of Canterbury eventually. And so we're talking about worlds and being at the service of the major powers of the time. I mean, the Duchy of Normandy, the Kingdom of England eventually. So, and the Reformed papacy at the same time, living across France, Italy, and so on. And this shows naturally the necessity from the side of the incipient feudal monarchies to provide themselves with people who knew how to talk, who knew how to express their thoughts, to affirm an ideology, to make it functional to the hierarchy of the time, and to therefore provide an ideal vest, also what was the sometimes the crude reality, but still civilizational build-up that was taking place at that point, and with important conflict, right? The investiture controversy was not just a thing between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. Was as the case, in fact, of Lanfranc of Pavia and Anselm of Aosta. This had to do with, famously enough, with the Archbishopric of Canterbury, its primacy over the other dioceses in the English kingdom, and properly with the investitures in the same realm, because the Norman conquerors had hoped to treat England and its church fundamentally as kind of an absolutistic way, right, with the holding, keeping control on the investitures of the bishops, which was an enormous deal, politically speaking. These figures also opposed the kings, but still the kings kind of needed them, right, and were the same ones who had put them there, exactly because they were so also, in fact, theologically and therefore, mentally skilled and could administrate, in fact, also this very important assets as the church once were, that also provided for, military power to the royal armies and so on. And this was unavoidable, so it's always like a love and hate relation, right? And good things come in part from this for the individual, for civilizations, because without conflict there can't be an improvement. After all, this conflict exists for a reason. There can't be a positive solution to that. So the same happened within the same church, within the same ecclesiastical thinkers. In fact, this dialectical expansion provoked, because of mostly of theological reasons, they will all want with them. This was, as we will see now, fundamentally an inquiry on God and how to think properly, ontologically about him, and how this reflected properly in what the thinkers could do and what could be affirmed also in the councils and so on. So something extremely important also for politics at that point, because it defined the various spheres of influence, also the secular ecclesiastical power, would provoke ferocious debates among the many scholars at this time were emerging, especially in France, right, that theologically speaking, around the school of Chartres, eventually what would become the Studium of Paris would remain essentially the theological capital of Europe, right? France, in this sense, also as the beating heart of the most hierarchical system existing secularly, but backed in that sense by an equally developed church. At least, of course, this was all guided by Rome in that sense. But the best theological studies came from northern France. And at the time, Fulbert of Chartres, Bishop of Chartres, this great thinker considered at the time, had in fact debated mostly and among each other as well, and sometimes against the same Fulbert, on the meaning to attribute to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And this was a big deal because albeit giving a preeminence to the values of faith, so to essentially deem the existence of spiritual substances to be uniquely a problem of faith, Fulbert in philosophy was a Platonic to the point of expressing on the problems of the universals, the dispute of universals, as you know, as a realist. That is to say, in that specific instance, to affirm that there was an objective existence of the essences. In other words, he thought that every object, despite being part of a broader universal category, still retained fundamentally a uniqueness in its kind. And this thought was influenced also by the Aristotelian idea of the essence as substance. And so it affected gravely the problem of the Eucharist, because the consecrated host would maintain fundamentally an imperfection due to the fact that it was that host specifically and materially, and that therefore also from a substance point of view couldn't basically be another thing, and especially not an homogeneous one and a perfect one like the body of Christ was meant to be. So this caused an enormous debate, and it was, as I understand, a very serious problem, because it basically denied that the host was the actual body of Christ after he had been consecrated. And actually the proponent of this was not Fulbert himself, but his pupil, Berengar of Tours, that had in fact openly claimed this as it was a scandalous thing, because it basically was in favor of the interpretation of an interpretation, at least, of the Eucharistic realism that didn't go beyond the mystical language of St. Augustine, that would simply say, it's a matter of fate. Either you believe it or not. That's it, right? You can't subject it to dialectic. And that's, in fact, what as we'll see now, what Berengar would be criticized for. And this thought of Berengar was avoiding essentially the very concrete objectivization that had been proposed by some theologians in the Carolingian age, and that eventually had spread within the Western Christendom as a consequence. And that was it, right? It was really affirmed, right? And so this new idea that the Eucharist might have not been the literal body of Christ was already at the time unacceptable. And so that's why also the thing would shipwreck as an idea. But still, the fact that somebody like Berengar was a famous pupil, Fulbert, etc., could just express them and there would be some followers was a matter of big debate, especially in the same years in which the papacy was essentially assuming its own monarchic physiognomy and therefore demanding from... Interestingly enough, and this is also what Lanfranc of Pavia would, might have been... we'll see now, there was a moment in which he distanced himself even from Gregory VII, that he had known also when he was still Hildebrand of Soane, and that he estimated the fact that Gregory didn't condemned Berengar's positions more than much. They didn't take it. Instead, it had been a really big deal, at least in France. Maybe Lanfranc had at that point been more sensitive to the issue for what it entailed. But lots of things were going on at the same time as well. Also for the papacy to not just to think about these intellectual issues, merely intellectual issues, but they're not just mere ones, because they had, as we'll see now, also to do properly with an idea of the world and of power, what this entailed for the papal monarchy and the secular monarchies. What is important here is also to realize that there had been some prodromes to these speculations. In many ways, these were issues that were re-emerging because they had, the various speculations had died out during the early medieval centuries, and fundamentally there hadn't been enough room for further debate. Now, the world was reviving, and so these ideas would come on the fore once again, some of which still unresolved, or at least not defined as, in detail as these subtle thinkers wanted. But it's still important to observe that there is connection with the Carolingian culture that at the time had been important. Also, more recently, the Ottonian one, because it's basically the Ottonian court that would give, we're mentioning in the beginning, Gerberto Aurillac, and therefore this new spiritual horizons that were provided in an ever more universal sense. In fact, to not to the empire, but probably to a church on its own. The empire always being crippled by its own, secular shortcomings, especially at that point, and the church instead gaining momentum in a clamorous way, needing this new horizons and culture. But the Ottonian court had essentially nurtured those same ideas, and stressing also the importance of the universality of the romanity, of an homogeneity, also in the thinking, in the ideology, and really a leap forward, a significant one, had been taken during Ottonian times. It would be, as we have explained many times, it would set, place the same seed plant the same seed of the reform, right? The Gregorian Reformation, paradoxical, kind of backfired also against secular power in a sense. But as we've seen, the two universal powers were always intertwined. And what is evident from these philosophical debates is that they were increasing in dialectical vigor. They were ever more heated in practice, and they were ever more vehemently pushed. And in this sense, this shift towards rationalism, if you want to call it this way, also with the renewed attention towards Aristotle, it was, however, from all of these thinkers, not just Berengar, right, is an important issue to take in consideration, because as we've seen, the matter of the Eucharist stemmed from a more rationalistic approach. But this doesn't mean that Berengar of Tours was particularly more rationalist, let's say, than other thinkers. As a matter of fact, he also had unavoidably a Platonic, or better, Neoplatonic background. And that's where we get to Lanfranc of Pavia and of Anselm of Aosta. So this interesting figures, because as you understand, were both Italians. They both became archbishops of Canterbury through their Norman medium, and they also both saints, and both philosophers, and Anselm especially famously being, after Scotus Eugenes, essentially from a chronological point of view, the first real medieval philosopher, right? And that also left us a consistent amount of works. As for figures like Fulbert of Chartres, Berengar of Tours, and the same Lanfranc of Pavia. Actually, we have a modest amount of works. They're very important for the time and places, but say there is at this point probably an expansion also in the production of philosophical works altogether were written down. Today's video is not really about just the individual, right, and not even the theory altogether. We will just look at this dialectical reflection on dialectics as properly the bridge that could exist. In fact, this was the other approach between faith and reason, and still with the subordination of the latter to the former. But they're both interesting figures in general for the context in which they lived, which is also kind of overlooked. In fact, among the adversaries of Berengar, we take into account this monk of Langebert, of Italic origin, Lanfranc of Pavia, that assumed a particular importance. Now, this figure is quite interesting because, as we were saying before, he was actually a secular man. He had studied, if not in Pavia, in some other northern Italian city, as the liberal arts and law, right? As at that time, we made many videos about the history of law, the revival of the Roman one, especially in the Italian, context and why it emerged there. So there were all these ferments, and he was initially a layman. He didn't have any ecclesiastical tendency, not even at any point, differently from Anselm. And he had moved to France. We don't know why, probably because the Italic situation was pretty turbulent at that point, so he decided to move away and to go to France to essentially teach law, as it was quite remunerative. So, and we've seen how the French and the Italian juridical schools were always very close, right? Not just, say, in part more evidently the Northern Italian and the Occitanian one, but properly the Northern French and the Northern Italian one. Also for other reasons that include the Norman link that is often connected just to Southern Italy and the previous, also think about Mont Saint-Michel and Saint Michael in the Gargan, etc. So these enormous, let's say, Western Frankish, especially flow that from Normandy flowed into southern Italy, but often, and this is overlooked, for the same Norman conquest of Sicily of Longobard elements, together with others like, of course, Bretons, Flemish, even Germans, etc. And by accident, while he was kidnapped crossing a forest in northern France by some brigands, Lanfranc made a vow to survive, and so he did, and he fulfilled it by becoming a monk. And so he started his journey in the monastery of Bec, the Abbey of Bec, that had been founded by a Norman knight that eventually had become a monk and had kind of started this actually pretty small community that was like kind of a hermetic one. The monastery of Bec still exists, right? Lanfranc had started initially, I think, a school of liberal arts in the same Mont Saint-Michel. Bec is still in Normandy, and he had quite of a career because he was noticed for his intellectual skills. Initially he was disappointed actually by the life of the Bec monastery, and he had problems with his prior, but eventually he became actually his greatest trustee, and by some connections he managed to enter the same entourage of William the Bastard at the time, so much that he became abbot of the Count Church of Saint-Etienne. I don't know if you ever visited. It's very beautiful. It's enormous today. At the time, it was different naturally, but it was very important. And so he became one of the most important figures, spiritual figures in Normandy, if not maybe the most important, given that he was also a counselor of the same William. So much that he, in the meanwhile, he participated to an important load of affairs. First of all, his teaching had attracted many pupils from France, Flanders, Germany, Italy, and there are big names here, like Yves of Chartres, the famous canon lawyer. The same Anselm of Aosta, as we will see now. We are not sure actually of Anselm of Lucca and Anselm of Baggio that eventually would become Alexander II. They surely knew each other because eventually Lanfranc traveled extensively together with the papacy, also in Germany. In Italy, he was there at many events. He met a lot of this great international secular and spiritual figures. But some things are legends. Like we're talking about the early 11th the late 11th century. So not really, we don't have really the altar details on everything, but surely we know that he was had very important connections. And he would become, after the Norman conquest of England, Archbishop of Canterbury. And here he had quite a role because at that time the primacy of the Canterbury Archbishopric was not traditional. As a matter of fact, he had to struggle with the same. First of all, he had to await that the Anglo-Saxon Archbishop died, and only eventually he came to be to take his place. Then there were controversies where the Archbishop of York was already a Norman, but still, about the primacy of in England, and he managed to affirm this also with some documents, and he had this the English council recognized the authority over all the archbishoprics of England. This, by the way, Lanfranc was the right man in many ways, because, as you know, the main English archbishoprics had maintained since the time of the Gaelic missionaries this kind of monastic nature, with literally a monastery attached to the archbishopric, and his monastic experience in that sense was quite useful, because he began to administer the local monastery quite effectively. It enlarged it. It built a lot of new structures, and he was very committed to his task. And he opposed himself in part to the same William's demands on a greater, in fact, secular control over the church. He was very aware of his prerogatives. And we remember him here because he opposed himself to the Eucharistic theories formulated by Berengar of Tours. He participated at the synods of Vercelli in 1050, of Tours in 1055, and of Rome in 1050. He wrote, especially on the subject, the Libellus de Sacramento Corporis et Sanguinis Christi contra Berengarium, in fact, that consecrated him as the best theologian of his generation, of his day. And he, as we were saying before, he came from essentially the same cultural background, like a Neoplatonic one, but still with some Aristotelian elements. And Lanfranc is important because he indicated in dialectic not a perverse art, right? As some thinkers at the time had accused, in fact, the same, because of the use that had been done of it by Berengar, the conclusions that he had drawn on the Eucharist. On the contrary, dialectic for Lanfranc was an instrument susceptible of being used to confirm the propositions accepted by faith, right? And it's difficult if you know Anselm of Aosta's more famous thought, what how close this concept is to Anselm credo ut intelligam. In fact, Lanfranc said that the essentially faith and the authority of the fathers of the church is necessary to affirm such ideas, not through logic, right? Dialectic has to submit to faith and to authority. And he reproached to Berengar, quote literally, by abandoning the sacred authorities, you take refuge yourself in dialectic. But if I had to receive or given an answer concerning the mysteries of faith, I would prefer to hear as a response and to answer myself that they have to do with they pertain to the sacred to the holy authorities rather than the reasons of dialectic, right? But as a celebrated logician himself, he couldn't condemn dialectic, that in fact he deemed could help to understand also the divine mysteries, but that it has to be submitted to the authority of the scriptures when it entered in conflict with them, and just apparently so, because logic and dialectic in that sense had to actually adjust if they were wrong. It's because you had misused them, right? And not because there was much of a problem themselves, because basically God had created them for them to be fruitfully and in fact reasonably employed. And Lanfranc had an easy life, as we were saying before. He lived in a difficult time, the same struggle for ambassadors between the reigns of Henry III, Henry IV of the Holy Roman Empire. At this time, there was also an anti-pope, Clement III, that Henry IV had created in opposition to Gregory VII. Here there were some attritions also, because Anselm was also an ambitious man, and he was very, as we were saying before, very careful, very committed in his work of Archbishop of Canterbury, in a position that would, in a sense, reject, in fact, the harshest demands of William, at least, but still cooperate importantly with the king, in this sense, and yet kind of distancing himself somewhat from the same reformed papacy, in at least in the form of Gregory VII, himself, politically speaking, to maintain a sort of autonomy in between. But there weren't even particular attritions with the papacy either, right? These were even the same primacy of Canterbury over the other English dioceses was fundamentally tacitly accepted by Gregory VII. Much at this time was already like kind of in becoming, right? And it was difficult to put things together and to formalize and sanction them. Just things would happen customarily, traditionally, but sediment also because of the will of this man. Now, this same conception of dialectic, as we've seen, is to be found in Lanfranc's great disciple, Anselm of Aosta. Now, Anselm is a very famous figure, but also his background is fascinating. He essentially was a nobleman of a decadent noble family. His father was a Lombard, his mother was a Burgundian, and he had manifested since his early youth, the desire to take the spiritual life, something that his father didn't want for him. In fact, it was an attrition in this regard, where some back and forth he at some point, especially the death of his mother, who was a pious woman, seemingly brought him astray towards more secular ideals, but at a certain point he broke with his father, and he decided with a serf just to cross the Alps to go to Burgundy, then eventually to France. He roamed around for 3 years. When he finally was attracted by the fame of Lanfranc in the abbatial school of Bec, where he went, and also after Lanfranc became Archbishop of Canterbury, he became abbot of the monastery for a long time. Actually, as he would eventually succeed the same Lanfranc, if I'm not wrong, died in 1085, if I'm not wrong. And in fact, at the end of the 11th century, Anselm would get the Archiepiscopal Cathedra of Canterbury as well. The kings he had to deal with were, in fact, William II and Henry I, and the relation between the two was strained because also Anselm had a great, in spite of the initial, not timidity, but probably humility, modesty, he was a very good archbishop. He had a great sense of his role, and he in fact always maintained, a bit like Lanfranc, this double face, in fact, of the intellectual that he also covered pretty well, considering his extraordinary written production, but also the strong man of church and of power in that regard. So much that, in fact, he had problems with the sovereigns. He was exiled twice. Especially the harshest conflict was with William II, who had a much harder line than his father on the issue of investitures, to which, in fact, Anselm didn't bend, however, but he was obliged to leave England for initially, and so he traveled again in France and Italy. In this period, he, of course, this point, he was a major international figure also, and he also composed his philosophical works. He was known as a thinker to everybody for his argumentation, right, with a Platonic Augustinian inspiration, definitely, on the existence of God. He wrote some works on the attributes of God. He essentially had the Augustinian view, for which the idea of perfection of God was shown by the fact that there are different layers of perfection that you can look at in the creation, and therefore this pointed to the perfection and to the possibility, the human possibility, naturally, of elevating oneself to the spirits. So it's the Platonic idea, from which he derived the idea of the certainty of God from the within of our mind, of our thought, right? A certainty that, in fact, he judged to be intrinsic to human mind as necessary reference, and, as we would say today, constitutive of the same. In other words, human mind can work at its best if you accept God and you have faith. After that, you can practically open to a philosophical speculation, because from that standpoint, logic and dialectic will make sense for you to understand the world on the base on your faith, without which there can't be a real understanding. This is a crucial element that recurs also in my narrative of history and of properly the importance of sacred as the utmost reason for which living in the first place. That is to say, if you live in a world that is faulty, and that you fundamentally have a difficulty in living in, the question is, how much price do you give to basically anything you want to achieve, even for the fact of being provided with this extraordinary faculties that we have the slightest idea where they come from, and so if you put a standard that is not absolute, you cannot fundamentally appreciate anything. We will always own a relativistic view, and this is beyond even the same Christian concept. Again, these were also pagan ideas, right? Platonism, was before Christianity, but the same Christians had adopted this philosophical means, because essentially every people in every culture and every civil had always believed the same, right? So it was impossible to have any other view, and at this point in high medieval Europe, you have probably a reactivation of this awareness, and so the feeling of the necessity that you don't have today. You say to somebody, you should antepose faith to reason, or even more to subject the latter to reform, and say, wow, you're a bigot. You don't think. The question is, do you know what that actually means? Because if you stop thinking about that and you have at least an idea of what it takes, just as a leap of faith, literally to undertake any enterprise, you cannot really, there is no other direction fundamentally that you can follow in anything, and anything that goes in reverse is fundamentally a loss of any, in fact, properly scientific understanding about anything, because you can't judge things at that point from a standpoint that is not absolute, and therefore you cannot measure how important they really are. And this absoluteness is, Anselm justified the existence of God also on the base of the idea that nothing greater than him was possible to be thought, right? And so this reveals also a mathematical realization, of course, that there is a concept of infinite that we need to make sense of reality in any case, right? Without the concept of infinite, that is something that we haven't the slightest idea what it means. We can't have things like maths, like physics. I mean, the entire geometrical reality is founded on essentially three fictional things, that is point, line, and plane, surface. Do these things exist? Have you ever seen them? No, but you need them, because you realize that nature, as it's structured, fundamentally follows them as kind of asymptotes, and if you follow them to the infinite, you can always get a better understanding of reality, and we need to fix them as absolutes in geometry in order to make sense. But where did we get this from? From the vision of the world, which is incidentally enough what the same Saint Anselm says, that humanity can come through the to the knowledge of things, right? It is essentially to the vision of them that can be known, right? And that is a sort of in fact avatar that, however, the better investigated, the closer it gets to the properly to the absolute of it. The one of God is the verbum, is the word, is the logos, of course. So here, hence you understand the importance of dialectics, of the Bible, of the scriptures, and of knowledge altogether. So science at in the same time, what God has created for us. And this is, in fact, even interestingly enough, like a Kantian idea. Think about the nomen and the fact that Kant says that, you can basically know within the range of, within a certain range, that is in theory infinite as well, but that never tell you what the true essence of things are, but what counts is really what eventually you can't get through your senses, through your reason about them. So will you ever see an atom or understand what it is? You really can't, right? It doesn't make sense. You just know that there is, because we have proven it through other means. But it's the point is not to understand its essence. The important is to understand how this is effectively affecting our life, and how we can cope with that. And that's the entire purpose of science in many ways. So these are incredibly modern thoughts, as a matter of fact, and they're not mere, positions or opinions or whatever. They're something that, of course, took their own form, their own speech, their own articulation. If you read these works, you can there are interesting, I don't know, ideas such as the Holy Trinity explained, thinking about the human soul that has multiple capacities, like, the one of action, intelligence, memory, something like this. That's how Anselm puts that. But it's so one can wonder. But the fact that somebody in the 11th, 12th century had already gotten to this point, and that was not just, some guy, but he was literally Archbishop of Canterbury, exiled twice. With Henry I, he had some better relation. He was also a tough guy, and he, as you know, quite an effective king. And he still wanted to impose again the matter of the investitures on the clergy, but he was stopped by Anselm once again. But he didn't. He actually started cooperating with him also internationally with important, with his marriage, etc. There were many, there was a common ground. But I mean, these people are not random, right? They start from, as you see here, also this essentially Italic background, this proximity to the revival of juridical studies, to the Gregorian reforms that in fact necessitated enormously from that as well, the development of kingdoms, secular authority. So this all tells us that those ideas, those philosophies, and the same faith and belief actually empowered themselves. The greater the civilization, the greater the hierarchy, the greater the power, the responsibility, the understanding, and the range, the horizon is, right? So it's the reawakening of a clear thinking that it was putting naturally at the center of the issue also humanity once again. I mean, the possibility of struggling in this world to you see. In the Christian dimension, there is always the medium that, conceptually is different from what was believed in a sense in the pagan world, where there was no limit. In theory, everybody could save themselves, to speak in Christian terms. That naturally, I don't know if you have ever seen anybody transfiguring personally, by pure virtue, and because basically never did anything wrong and they're perfect, and so they simply ascend to the skies. I've never seen them, right? So the idea is that still Christianity said this, that also don't think too much. You're always you can't fail ever, because that's fundamentally silly, right? So that pinch of humility is also necessary to heroes, to people like even the Saint William the Conqueror that took over an entire new land through a hell of a battle, risking his life. So something that surely was seen from a military chivalric point of view in the old exalted military religious fashion, but that also needed this other, like the guy on the emperor's chariot in Rome that always this whispered in his ear, just remember that you are mortal, right? And so in that moment you are Jupiter, but when you bring the spoils up to the Capitol Hill, you still come back to be a man, essentially. So the difference between paganism and Christianity is not really that enormous as you've been brought to believe, also very often for ideological reasons that skip completely history of religion itself. I mean, history of religion, in the fact that basically we always believe the same thing because we are human beings, and this completely modernistic, secularistic delusion that for us at some point felt changed. It's basically it has no meaning on any ground historically speaking, and it just fuels further that process of moral relativism that was being criticized, in fact, by these authors, saying you can't just make it a mere reality, a merely dialectic point, because it will fail anyway. So you have to accept that there is a limit. But from that limit, reality develops, unfolds, and so that limit is necessary also for realizing that we can't know everything, because we're finite, because there is always something that doesn't matter how hard we try, we'll screw up, right? You can think it's original sin, you can think it's, at the time it was only because of original sin, of course, possibly. Otherwise, you can't think like in the past there wasn't such a thing. were some like Pelagian, these heresies that thought that original sin was great, and that they had to do, in fact, with that kind of also kind of Gnostic Manichaean bias. And in fact, don't think here that the Platonic Augustinian thing is just anecdotal. As you know, Saint Augustine was a fierce Manichaean before his conversion. In any case, the works they studied at the time were mostly the Timaeus, Boethius, right? So, Boethius even commented Aristotle. So it's kind of both things at the same time. So faith and reason as necessary, as a pair, as allies. And however, the Platonic humanism of Chartres was still the more kind of prevalent background in here. And so, if we look at figures like Lanfranc and Anselm, we definitely see the way through which the philosophical speculation could impose itself further in medieval schools, because they didn't, in fact, presume that dialectic was evil, per se. On the contrary, it's just a mean to know. Anselm was also essentially a promoter of the idea of evil as devoid of ontological positivity. That is to say, in fact, the correct initial, that's the pagan Christian idea, that evil is lack of anything, right? Hell itself doesn't quite exist. It's nothingness, in the same as the pagans believed back in the day. At least the celestial Apollonian ones that said that literally, if you were a hero, you could save and transfigure and go to heaven. Whereas if you were just part of the chthonic masses that believed that you superstitiously that you would be devoured, your body and soul would have been devoured by the deities of the underworld, and that you would essentially dissolve into at best be regenerated into something else. Well, you would have basically, that would have equated to disappear. Also because the souls, actually, that was the same belief that the real soul would have probably the mental bone would roam for some time on earth after that, but then it would have dissolved, whereas the one of heroes would have gone to heaven after having transfigured itself actively, right? So what the Christians now were thinking was a similar thing, and of course you can't save yourself, as we were saying before. That's the main difference. So you have to have faith in the absolute that in theory you should attain, but in this sense you have to struggle for attaining that. And so following that way, and you can follow this way in the world because you have means such as logic, reason, and dialectic. You can express yourself, you can improve thought, and definitely these thinkers like Lanfranc and Anselm definitely were some important cornerstones in properly the dialectical development in medieval Europe, and from which that whole kind of humanistic revival of the 12th century and beyond was born in many ways. So as we were saying before, this was just two rings of the chain intertwined, and also their lives, as we have seen, are fascinating contextually, where they lived, what they did, this pan-European connection. You understand here? There is a connection: England, France, Italy, and also the students from everywhere, Germany, etc. So when we talk about Western Europe and we talk about what medieval history really means, looking at this world, never forget that the post-Carolingian common ground, the idea that there was a common way Europeans at that time, Western Europeans at that time wrote. They had a common format. They had a shared background. It was a cultural connective tissue made up of these monasteries. You see what these people do. They're born somewhere, and then they go somewhere else to search for an answer, like Saint Anselm roaming France for 3 years before settling in Normandy. And because he had heard of this guy, that also had fundamentally gone from Pavia to France to to seek fortune by teaching the dialectic itself. So this thought was attractive because they thought, this is the point, they realized that you cannot attain that knowledge, you cannot achieve those results as a human being, as a Christian, if you do not think, if you do not search constantly for knowledge, and if you at the same time are not able to discipline yourself by knowing that knowledge, doesn't matter how much it is, it will never be complete, but still what matters in this world is making the difference in increasing that knowledge always more, and also for others to learn, for these works that were written, studied by scholars. And so a world that ages, but hopefully ages by maintaining high its own moral capacity, and therefore withstanding to the ultimate clash against the forces of evil that will try to take over heaven. But as you know, the saying goes, indeed, non prevalebunt, right? So there is that these are chapters like we mostly study them in history of philosophy. I think I remember credo ut intelligam intelligo ut credam. These were in high school, like when I studied history of philosophy, Anselm of Aosta, etc. And they, if you learn them just in that context, you don't kind of get the historical background that sometimes is much more interesting, right? I think if you want to teach kids this stuff, you should, like, if you start telling these kind of apparently abstract issues, etc., if you don't contextualize it in the times, in the background, in this broader civilizational development, people will not kind of get interested in them as much. I mean, some people get fascinated with the same ideas if they're very cerebral and intellectual, but at the same time, until you know, let's say banally again, who was Anselm of Aosta? You have to explain that, right? Because again, also what the Archbishopric of Canterbury meant at the time, what it meant at the time to be a king's counselor, right? These are not, again, in the incredibly ignorant world we live in. I say incredibly ignorant again, not to be humble, because of, you know, I think that I know who knows what, but let's say exactly because I realize how few in general we all know about things we should know, and considering that as a civilization we have taught these things and nobody still knows them, right? And these are very simple concepts, by the way, that I can make a YouTube video for, but there are people who spend their entire academic life studying, researching on these characters. You can't really give meaning to anything, as these same authors said. You know, what's the purpose of life if you don't learn? But if you don't learn seriously, like as an absolute purpose of existence, not as, you know, I will look, you know, I'll watch a Schwerpunkt video every once in a while. That cannot work, will not work by itself. And you have to make this enormous effort, because, again, accepting something like there is an absolute that you can't understand, that you have to understand anyway, that is the only way for you to understand what you think you can afford to understand, is a great self-disciplining proof. Right, and also considering, in fact, the monastic background of these people and how they lived, like the 11th century wasn't really easy for anyone, is yet another horizon. I confess that I struggled too, I still do in a way, to understanding monastic history in many ways. I mean, I understand the secular clergy, in a way, the bishops' powers and so on. But when you think about monastic life, that's always like something you should think twice about, because you don't quite get the motivation, and this is the main obstacle that we have historically. We're dramatically crippled in understanding history and its meaning because we do not have the mindset of those people. You can, and that's where materialism leads nowhere, because you can have all the material evidence you want, but until there is not a voice that tells you, look, in this time I thought this, and voices properly this feeling and this needs, these ideas, this concerns, you can't quite understand anything about that time. It will be just like dumb mannequin automas that populate this weird past stories, and you will effectively not realize that these were people like us that had thoughts that are actually extremely relevant and purposeful for us still today to be concerned about, right? And this is why this stuff must be studied, right? And I'm kind of disappointed in this regard, because every time I make a video about ecclesiastical history, everybody says, oh, it's boring, you will not watch it, it doesn't get any view. And I get that, because I'm kind of like, I would be like that too. But I taught myself not to think like that, right? And this is crucial enough now. And it's always been, but it must be revived, right? You don't understand it just once and then you have to make it effort, as always. You have to give something in turn in exchange, right? And this is, again, in part what the saying Christianity basically says. If you don't make a sacrifice, if you're not willing to make that sacrifice, but not just Christianity, of course, the question is, where are you going? Are you even going anywhere? That's the point, right? Alright, so for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. For now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.